The MVC framework has supported async methods as controller actions since version 4, and if you want all the details, I have complete coverage of this topic in the ASP.NET MVC4 Fundamentals course. That course looks at what happens behind the scenes, shows you how to execute work in parallel, how to work with timeouts, lots more. The quick refresher for this feature is that you can write an MVC controller action with the async keyword, and that action will return a task of T. Then the MVC framework will know how to execute that action properly. Inside of an async action, you'll have one or more await keywords. The nice thing about await in a web application is that await can free up the thread to work on other requests that are waiting in the ASP.NET pipeline. We only have a finite number of threads to process requests, so tying up threads with long input-output operations, that can reduce scalability. Async and await, they will keep threads busy processing requests instead of waiting around for network calls. But I will apply a caveat to that statement and say that async await, it's not a magic bullet. In fact, there's some scenarios where using async can hurt performance and throughput. So something that you should do for all types of performance optimizations is benchmark your application, take measurements, and make sure what you're doing is actually helping and not making the software worse. Now for async and await to be effective, you need an async API to call into. This version 6 of the Entity Framework now provides an async API. We'll take a look at that now. Let's look at the books controller in the application. The Entity Framework now provides methods with an async suffix, both as members of the DB context directly, and also some extension methods that end with the word async. The methods that have the async capability are typically methods that produce some sort of immediate concrete result. For instance, toList is something that will immediately execute a query, and it is something that I could call asynchronously. Instead of using toList, I'll use toList async. Now what is not immediately obvious here is that toList async no longer returns a list of books, it returns a task of list of book. Because this now returns a task of list of book, and not just a list of books, I have to be careful because that's not something that I just want to hand off to a view. If I come to look at that particular controller action now, I will get an error because that view expects an IEnumerable of book. It doesn't expect a task of something. And the easiest way to turn a task of T into T is to use the await keyword. So I want to await db.books.toListAsync. That means that this method will need to be marked with the async keyword, and this method also no longer returns an action result, it returns a task of action result. And to get this to work, I'll need to bring in the namespace system.threading.tasks. Now the task type is available, and I truly have an async controller action. And what does that mean? That means instead of waiting for the database to return all those results, we can free up the thread that is executing inside of that controller action. It can go off and process other requests. That same thread might come back when the async task is finished to complete execution of that controller action, or it could be another thread that comes in to do that. One of the things that you'll learn in the MVC4 Fundamentals course is that async doesn't necessarily mean multi-threading, doesn't mean I'll use multiple threads. It just means that I have an opportunity to free up a thread and return it back to the caller and let them do whatever they want with it, continue processing other requests. But eventually some other thread is going to have to come in here. Maybe it's the original thread, maybe not. Something will have to come in here and finish off this, execute the view, render HTML, and send stuff back down to the client. But at least I've freed up a thread for the little bit of time that that query took to process, which in this case, since we only have one record, isn't an enormous amount of time. I might be adding additional overhead that I didn't need, and that's why I would need to test and benchmark this application. But I'll just show you some of the async APIs that are available. I could also turn the details action into something that returns a task of action result. It's going to be an async method. And of course, the C# compiler will know when you declare an async method and you don't use the await operator, then there's no point in having this be an async method. What can I await inside of here? Well, again, Entity Framework, there's a find method. That produces a concrete result. It has to return a book to me. So instead of just calling find, I can call find async. That will return a task of book. And in order to turn that into a book, I can await the result. One more example. Let's look at the create action. The save changes method is something that has to communicate over the network, go to SQL Server, perform perhaps an insert, some updates, some deletes. I can turn this into an async task of action result. And what I would await inside of here is await save changes async. Now, if you just wanted to generate async methods by default, let's go back and look at the scaffolding. When I add a new controller, an MVC5 controller with views using the entity framework, I'm just going to call this books2. I want to use the book model class and booksDB, and now I'll select use async controller actions, click add. And this time the scaffolding will generate that code that I just wrote. So the index action returns task of action result, it's async. Details uses find async. And the create operation awaits db.savechanges async. And those are some of the primary async methods that you would use in an MVC application. Save changes async, find async, and toList async when you want to materialize the results of a query. What are some things that I could not make async inside of here? Well, if I had a query that just said db.books where the title of the book, given a book B, the title equals some string, where is just your typical link extension method. It returns iQueryable of t. There is no version of where async. Because link by default, these operators like where, they're lazy. They don't execute the query until you force that query to execute later on, which if I were to take this query and pass it into the view, this query variable, nothing would happen with SQL Server until the view started to for each through the results that where is returning. And because these operations are lazy and it's not actually executing a query at this point, there's really nothing to await. The only way I could await a query like this is to use an extension method like toList async or toDictionary async, or one of the methods that will produce a concrete result and force that query to execute at that point in time, which toList async would do. But you can see, using async await, relatively easy, and it does free up your threads to process additional requests that are in the pipeline. And it's something you should consider if you're trying to build a high throughput site. Just remember to make sure you take measurements and benchmark the application to make sure that async await is actually helping you.